All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Laracon 2017. How's everybody enjoying their time in New York so far? So my name is Adam Wathen, and today I'm here to talk to you about making your applications cruddy by design. So a few years ago, I saw this tweet from DHH, where he said a common problem that he sees in Rails applications is people not creating enough controllers, and that more controllers often eliminates the need for more sophisticated patterns. So when I saw this, I thought to myself, yeah, that's a useful insight. I agree with that. And I kind of went on my merry way, thinking that although I agreed with it and it sounded like a good idea, I was already sort of applying this thinking in my own code, and there was not really much for me to dig deeper into here, right? A few years later, right around the time Basecamp 3 came out, DHH tweeted this. These are the rake stats for the Basecamp 3 code base about 3 months after it came out, which kind of details how many of each type of class they have in the application, and how many lines of code there are in each one, how many methods per class, that sort of thing. And when I saw this, I sort of jumped out of my skin a little bit, because they have 206 controllers in this application. And not only that, if you exclude tests and front-end stuff, there's only about 450 classes in the entire app. So 206 out of 450 classes were controllers. Almost half the entire app was controllers. So when I saw this, I realized pretty quickly, maybe there was a little bit more to that original tweet than I thought. Maybe I'm not really applying this the way that I thought I was, and maybe there's some more stuff to learn here. So for the last year or so, I've been really kind of exploring this idea deeply, trying to figure out ways to use more controllers to simplify my code. And today I want to walk through a bunch of different examples to kind of share some of the lessons I've learned and hopefully give you some ideas that you can use to take home with you and apply in your work right away. So that's basically it for slides. So here's a demo application that we're going to be talking about. It's called Cast Hacker. And what Cast Hacker is, it's like a platform for discovering and hosting podcasts specifically for programmers. So you can see a bunch of popular programming podcasts. You might recognize some here. These are all podcasts that I subscribe to. You should check them out if you're a podcast fan. But here you can dive into a podcast. You can subscribe or unsubscribe to it. You can see some recent episodes. Maybe view all the episodes, dive into an episode and listen to it or check out the show notes. You can even view a list of all the episodes across all the podcasts on the platform. So if you're looking for something new, something recent, you can check that out here. And if you own a podcast, well, then you can control whether or not it's visible, like published or not. And you can also head into the settings and change some names and update the cover image, that sort of thing. Okay? So let's head over to the code side of things. So here's a handful of routes that we're going to be working with as I go through this talk. How's the font size? Is that OK for everybody? Cool? All right. So here you can see a bunch of routes that we've got hanging off of the podcast controller. So we've got an index view for listing all the podcasts, a view for showing a form for creating a podcast, a route that lets you submit that form to save a podcast, showing an individual podcast, edit form for a podcast, submitting that edit form, or archiving, deleting a podcast. And we've got a couple extra ones here, like showing all the episodes for a podcast, or replacing the cover image for a podcast with a new image, allowing people to subscribe to the podcast, unsubscribe, allowing the owner of the podcast to publish it or unpublish it. And then we've got some sort of basic CRUD actions for the episodes controller as well. So before we go any further, questions. How many people here work on an application or have inherited an application where there are controllers with 5 or more methods? Like every single person. OK. How many people have seen an application where a controller had 10 actions? Almost the same amount of people. Has anyone seen a controller with 15 actions on it before? Lots of people still. OK, perfect. So one thing to notice that I should have mentioned when we were looking at this stats here, the controllers in Basecamp have an average of 4 methods per controller. And I know from talking to David myself that they often have between 1 and 3 private helper methods on their controllers too. So this is really like maybe 2 or 3 actions per controller at best. Okay, so here on the podcast controller, we have 13 actions, and on the episodes controller, we have 6 actions. So if we're trying to apply this idea of trying to write more controllers to simplify our code, we need some sort of like heuristic or way to decide how to cut this controller up into more controllers, right? So I'm happy to say that after some careful experimentation and research, the easiest way to do that is just to follow one very simple, very basic rule. I like to call that rule the NWCA rule, all right? Which is never write custom actions on your controllers. So what is a custom action? So looking at this list of routes, you can see these first 7 are just kind of your standard resource actions, right? Like if we went into the terminal here and we went like artisan, make, controller, foo controller, resource, you can see these are like the 7 basic REST or CRUD actions that you get out of the box, right? Index, create, store, show, edit, update, and destroy. These are what I call standard actions, and anything else is a custom action. So list episodes is a custom action, update cover image is a custom action, subscribe, unsubscribe, publish, unpublish. These are all custom actions. So in our journey to sort of figure out ways to cut up this controller and create more controllers, the easiest way to do that, in my experience, is to avoid creating these custom actions and figuring out ways to remodel them as basic REST or basic CRUD actions. So to get started, what we want to do here is like draw a line in the sand between these first 7 actions and then these other 6. So let's start with the list episodes one first. So the way I like to start is by basically evaluating this current action against what our options are. Whoop. Okay, so here's our 7 basic CRUD actions, right? So list episodes. Which one fits best for listing episodes? It's a pretty simple one. We could all probably agree pretty quickly that it's probably an index action, right? Index is used to show a list of some resource, and here we're trying to show a list of episodes. Now, it doesn't make sense for this to be the index action on the podcast controller, because that's for listing podcasts. But you might think, okay, well, obviously what we should do here is use the index action on the episodes controller. It's a list of episodes. But if you scroll down and tried to do that, you'd realize pretty quickly, crap, we already have an index method on the episodes controller. Has anyone run into this situation before where they want to list all of a resource and a nested resource and they have to figure out where to put that stuff? Yeah? So if we're forcing ourselves to just use an index action here, we have to come up with some way to do it. And one way that I've seen people do it that I think is a bit of an anti-pattern that I want to talk about quickly is trying to piggyback off of the existing index action. So say we pulled this up here, and instead of having a podcast controller list episodes action, we pointed this route at the episodes controller index action, just like this one down here. But this one has a parameter, and this one doesn't. So what I've seen people do is head into this controller, have this take an optional ID, and then you think, okay, so now all I basically have to do is check. If there's an ID, scope the episodes to a podcast. There's a typo there, but that's okay. And you might think like that's as simple as it needs to be. That's all you have to do. But let's head over to the podcast controller for a second and look at the list episodes action and copy the body of this and paste it over here so we can compare them and see how similar or dissimilar they really are. So this is if there's an ID, we do this. If there's not an ID, we do this. So if there's an ID, we look for a podcast, not for episodes, but we preload the episodes. We have this sort of authorization check to make sure that podcast is visible to the current user because it might be unpublished. Then we return this podcast list episodes template passing through the podcast. In this case, we're searching just for episodes. We happen to be paginating them. We're returning an episodes index view, and we're passing episodes to it, not a podcast. So these are actually 2 totally different code paths. So if we try to piggyback off of this existing action and point 2 routes at it, what we're doing is we're taking 2 routes, we're funneling those down into a single action, and then we're making it the controller's responsibility to sort of reverse engineer the intent of the user and split that back up into 2 separate actions. And when you think about it that way, it seems like an obviously stupid thing to do. Don't do that. Okay. So if we don't want to do that, what can we do instead? It has to be an index action, right? We can't put it on the episodes controller. So we need a new controller. But what do we call this controller? Well, what I like to try and think about is like, what is the resource that we're trying to list? You might think, okay, well, we're trying to list episodes, right? But we're not just trying to list all episodes, any episodes. We're specifically trying to list a podcast's episodes. So what I do in this situation is I create a new resource called podcast episodes. So now we have a podcast episodes controller index action. We can go artisan, make controller, podcast episodes controller, head over to that controller with my cold fingers, and cut this action out of the podcast controller, paste that into the podcast episodes controller, call it an index action, and as long as we pull in our imports and stuff, we'd be done here. And we would have eliminated a custom action on the podcast controller and introduced a new controller to sort of simplify that a little bit. There's an interesting side benefit to this as well. So if you scroll down here to our episodes controller, you can see there's sort of two types of routes. There's the index one that's kind of scoped to episodes. Show has also got episodes at the beginning. Edit and update have episodes at the beginning. But create and store are scoped to a podcast because we want to create an episode for a podcast, right? So if we look at the episodes controller, you can see that we've got a show action that takes an ID, and that's the ID of an episode. But the create action also takes an ID, but now it's the ID of a podcast, not an episode. So that's a little bit confusing, right? And it's the same with store and then edit and update. Well, now that we have a dedicated podcast episodes controller, it acts sort of as a magnet for these sorts of endpoints that are scoped to a podcast. So we can pull those out of the episodes controller, point them at the podcast episodes controller, cut those actions out of here. So what's that? Store and create. So we can rip those out of here, paste those into the podcast episodes controller. And now instead of having an episodes controller with 6 actions, we have an episodes controller with 4 actions, and a new podcast episodes controller with 3 of its own actions. And now in the podcast episodes controller, every ID parameter is always the ID of a podcast instead of the ID of an episode. So it's a little bit more consistent. So tip number 1 that I want you to remember. If you have a nested resource, give it a dedicated controller. If you have posts and comments and you want to add a comment to a post, don't force yourself to decide, okay, should that be in the comments controller? Should that be in the post controller? Put it in the post comments controller and just be done. Just follow that convention and don't force yourself to make that decision anymore. And you'll end up with more smaller controllers, which will make your code kind of feel simpler and sort of make you feel less likely to want to reach for complicated patterns to solve some of these problems because your code already kind of feels simpler. Next one. Oh, I shouldn't have closed that. That's okay. Now we got to wait because it takes a while for Keynote to kind of load here, but we'll be fine. All right. Next custom action here. Let's move this new controller down here. The next custom action we got to deal with is updating a cover image. So updating a cover image is when you head over to like a podcast here, and we do something like, let's make sure this is published so we can see it. So we've got a form for editing the details for a podcast, which are kind of the basic columns. But then we've got a separate form for updating the cover image. So for whatever reason, the requirements dictated that we want to update the cover image separately from updating the rest of the details. So we could go here and like replace full stack radio with like a pink version of full stack radio. Whatever. Cool. And the way that we're exposing this is through a post request to an update cover image endpoint scoped to a podcast, pointed at an update cover image action on the podcast controller. Now, if you look at the implementation, it's pretty straightforward. Like update just takes a couple fields, validates them, and updates the corresponding fields on the podcast, right? Updating a cover image, all it does is save a file after doing some validation and update another column on the podcast. So if we're trying to evaluate this action against our list of REST actions, it's pretty natural to think, okay, well, this is updating, right? It says update right in the damn method name, so this is going to be an update in some way, shape, or form. So again, you might be tempted to try and piggyback off of the existing update action. And we might just say, okay, well, let's just like save the file in there, and we'll just use that one update action, and we'll get rid of this custom action. But you end up with that same problem of taking 2 discrete user intentions, funneling them into one controller, and trying to reverse engineer it. Because it's not as simple as just adding the cover image here. We have a title attribute that's required, right? Well, all of a sudden now, it's required if we think they're trying to fill out the top form, but it's not required if we think they're only trying to update the cover image. Things just get way unnecessarily complicated. So what do you do in this case? Cover images, it's not like a table, right? It's not like a resource. It's not an eloquent model. But because we're exposing the ability to edit the cover image separately to the user, we have to think about it as its own resource. Because to the end user of the application, it is its own resource. We can let them manipulate it on its own. So what I would do in this case is I would create yet another controller. I would call it the podcast cover image controller, and just give it an update action. And then I would even go and change this route. Instead of being a post request, and everyone just uses post when they have a custom action because they can't think of anything that really makes sense semantically, right? We could do a put instead because we're replacing the cover image. And we can take the action out of the endpoint, let the action live in the HTTP verb, and now we're just putting a new cover image in this sort of nested sub-resource. So we could go ahead and make a new controller called the podcast cover image controller. We can go to our podcast controller, grab the update cover image action, cut this out, paste it in here, rename it to just a put, and then we'd be done, okay? So we've created another custom controller, another new controller, and we've eliminated a custom action on the podcast controller. Sorry? Oh, I called it put? Doesn't matter because we're not going to run this code. It looks like I'm doing live code, right? It looks like I'm like, wow, this guy's so awesome at coding on stage, but it doesn't matter because we never run it, so it can all be broken. Okay, so tip number 2. If you have some sort of property or field that's not a table, but you expose the ability to manipulate it independently, treat it as its own resource and give it its own controller. Fuck, I keep closing this stupid keynote thing. All right, next one. Subscribe and unsubscribe. Things are getting a little bit more interesting now. Before we had list and update. It's easy to map list and update to index and update, right? It's really natural. But now that we're dealing with subscribe is like a totally different verb. So trying to model this in a RESTful or like CRUD-based way is a little bit more complicated. So let's evaluate it against our actions here. It's not index, it's not show. Create or store, that's possible. Edit or update, that's possible. Destroy, not destroying anything. Let's try and model it as a create or store action. The way that I like to do this is I try and phrase things to myself sort of like this. If I have a user and that user subscribes to a new podcast, what do I have now that I didn't have before? And if I can make that mental model make sense, then I can model this as a create action. So if a user subscribes to a podcast, what do I have that I didn't have before? I have a subscription to that podcast, right? So what I might do in this case is create a new controller called a subscriptions controller and give it a store action where we're storing a new subscription. And I would go ahead and even change the endpoint, right? Because if we're trying to do this standardized sort of approach, it's best if you can keep the endpoint sort of standardized too. So normally when you do like a store action, it just goes to the top level resource. So let's just make a post request to subscriptions. So let's go ahead and create this new controller and see what it looks like to port this over. Okay. So we head over to the podcast controller and grab the subscribe method, cut this out, and paste it in over here. There's one difference here, which is that we were getting the ID of the podcast to subscribe to as a route parameter before. But if we're treating this as a top-level subscriptions resource, we're not going to get that ID coming through. So instead, we need to accept it as like a request parameter. So we'll change this to store, and this ID will actually just become request podcast ID. That's how I would do this, all right? And the implementation is we have a belongs to many relationship between podcasts and users. I'm using the attach method to insert a new row into that pivot table, right? And that's kind of how we model subscribing to a podcast. Cool. that one's done. Let's look at the next one, unsubscribe. Okay, well typically, if subscribing to a podcast is creating a subscription, then unsubscribing would be destroying that subscription, right? So let's try and see what we get. So typically for a destroy action or a delete request, you have the resource name and then the ID of what you're trying to delete. So we might have something like delete, subscriptions, and then an ID. Now to point out our subscriptions controller, destroy method. Yeah? And I know this bracket's backwards. Again, we're not going to run the code. But you might look at this and think, wait a second, ID of what? Like subscriptions is like a pseudo resource that we've represented in our endpoints, but it's not actually a real thing. We don't have an ID of a subscription. Or do we? If we head over to SQL Pro here, you see I've got this podcast user table, which is like the standard naming convention for a boring pivot table in Laravel, right? It's just the name of both resources combined, and that's how you kind of map them together with a belongs to many relationship. And each record here kind of maps a user to a podcast, and that's how we know that user subscribed to that podcast. Well, each one of these records has an ID. And if you think about it, a better name for this table might be subscriptions. Spelled correctly, even. And if we have a subscriptions table, well, then we could head over to our code, we could look at our user model, we could say that a user belongs to many subscribed podcasts through the subscriptions table now, instead of through the default table name. And then our podcast has many subscribers or users through that same table as well. Well, too many quotes. It's all good, though. All right, so now we have a name for a table. And now that we have a table called subscriptions, well, maybe we want to go ahead and even create an eloquent model for that table. Artisan make model subscription. And now we have a model that represents that table. And now in our subscriptions controller, instead of using this pivot table thing, well, we could just go ahead and create a subscription, right? We could say subscription create, and just specify the user that we're creating the subscription for. And the podcast. And the nice thing about this is that now we actually get a subscription object back that has an ID. We can even return the subscription from this endpoint so you could see the new subscription that you have. And now that we have a subscription model that has an identifier, it doesn't seem so far-fetched to expose the ability to destroy a subscription by passing in the ID of the subscription that you want to destroy. So if we went over to the podcast controller again here, we could grab this unsubscribe method, rip it out, move that over to the subscriptions controller, rename it to destroy. And now instead of looking for a podcast through that ID, what we might actually do is head over to our user class, create a new relationship, because now that a user has many podcasts through the subscriptions table, the user also has many subscriptions, and a podcast also has many subscriptions. So you can kind of cut that relationship into two pieces and treat it separately if you want to. So here in our user model, we could do something like create a has many relationship to subscriptions. And then in our subscriptions controller, we can say something like auth, user, subscriptions, find or fail, the ID of the one that we want to delete. And then instead of like detaching that pivot record or whatever, we can be more expressive in our code and say that we actually want to delete that subscription. And then return an empty 204 response. It still seems fine. It's kind of an AJAX request or whatever. Cool. So that gives us the ability to kind of remove two more custom actions from our podcast controller. So we can move those down here underneath our podcast image controller. And that brings us to tip 3 here, which is that if you have something that touches pivot records and creates new pivot records or deletes new pivot records, try creating a new controller for that too and think of it as its own resource. And you probably want to create a new model too. Something that I find very helpful when dealing with belongs to many relationships in my Laravel applications is to try and give that table a better name than the default name, get myself a model for that table. And then you have this nice side benefit of having a class that exists to sort of represent this relationship. Now, what you'll find typically is you'll have all sorts of behaviors sort of emerging in your application where before you had to think, should this go on the users class or should this go on the podcast class? And they're related to the subscription in some way. But now that you actually have a subscription class, you'll find this becoming sort of a magnet for behavior related to users being subscribed to podcasts. So it helps you keep your user model simpler and the podcast model simpler, which is kind of nice. I'm running a little bit faster than I expected, so I want to show you one quick tip that I was going to cut out before, but it's really cool. So something that I hate about creating these like pivot record relationship models this way is sort of letting the ID columns leak out into my controller. You might have done stuff in the past like post, comments, create to try and create a new related record without specifying the foreign key, which is nice because then that foreign key only needs to be known by that model that actually holds that foreign key. If you try and do this with a relationship where there's 2 foreign keys on it, the best you can ever do by saving it through the relationship is eliminate just one of those foreign keys. You always need to kind of choose which one you want to expose and which one you want to hide. And that sort of sucks to me. I hate when there's like 2 options and neither of them feel like ideal. So a trick that I've been using lately is, with Eloquent, you have mutators, right? So people might do something like set password attribute on a user model that takes like a password. And then you might want to automatically hash that password. So you could do something like, this attributes password equals bcrypt password sort of thing, right? Sort of intercept the act of setting that property and manipulate it in some way. It's useful for like lower casing things that come in if you want to normalize strings or trimming white space, sorts of interesting things like that. Something that I don't see a lot of people doing that I think is kind of interesting is you can use a mutator to set a totally different column. It sounds kind of crazy, but here we're doing something like we're specifying the user ID and the podcast ID, right? Well, what if in our user class, in our subscription class, we created a mutator for setting the user attribute, not the user ID, and this takes a user. Now, instead of trying to set a user property, because there is no user property, we can do something like this attributes user ID equals like user get key. And if you want to sort of simulate how Laravel's sort of relationship caching works, you can even do something like this set relation user to be this user, and that user will be sort of preloaded. So if we do that with both the user and the podcast, all right, lots of repetitive typing here, but maybe it'll make it easier to follow and understand. That's my excuse. If you do something like this, and we would have the user and podcast relationships defined here in this case, right? I'm going to skip that for the sake of time. But now in the subscriptions controller, instead of setting the ID of each, you could just set the user entirely to this whole user and the podcast to this whole user. And now it feels like, yeah, I'm creating a subscription for this user and this podcast. So you're not letting the IDs leak out, which is it's kind of cool. It kind of gives you that nice relationship creation benefit for creating something that has multiple foreign keys. I think it's kind of a cool trick. All right. The last example that I want to go through is publish and unpublish. So how do we map publish to a CRUD or a REST action? If you look at the implementation in the podcast controller, you can see that what publish does is it calls a publish method on the podcast. And the publish method on the podcast just sets the published at column to be a new timestamp. So really, the act of publishing a podcast is just updating a field on the podcast table. So it seems like it could just be an update action. And unpublish is basically doing the same thing, just the reverse. So again, you might be tempted to take that route of trying to piggyback off of the existing update action, yeah? So in the podcast controller, you might think, okay, well, why don't we just point publish at update, and we'll just allow this to set the published at timestamp as well. The thing that sucks about that is the way that we're setting that column here is through this nice, convenient, expressive method that's saying publish this podcast, which goes ahead and updates that column. If we try to piggyback off this update action, you'll find yourself tempted to specify published at equals fresh timestamp or equals the timestamp that came in from the request right here. And that kind of sucks, because what if I wanted to do something in the podcast like fire an event when the podcast was published? Like podcast was published, dispatch this. If I move this implementation right into my controller, I don't have this ability to sort of like connect these two behaviors easily anymore. Right? So my code is a little bit less flexible, and you're just sort of like manipulating your code to make things easier, despite the fact that, again, there are two different intentions from the user. Publish is just a button on one screen, and updating is like a whole form at a whole other endpoint. So no good. Avoid. So what can we do instead? Well, we have this example for the cover image controller, right, where we're trying to put a new cover image resource there. So you might think, well, maybe we have like a published sub-resource for the podcast, and maybe we put true there or something. But that feels kind of weird, because like you're making a put request to publish, you're passing in like published equals true, it's duplicating it. It's just not really that interesting. It can work, but I think there's like another interesting approach that is worth talking about that'll teach you something new that we haven't covered yet. What if we try to model publishing as a create action instead of as an update or edit action? Getting back to that original idea of we have a podcast, we publish it, what do we have now that we didn't have before? Do we have anything new? Is there anything new that we have? It's still just a podcast, right? Well, now we have a published podcast. Before we just had a plain old podcast. Now we have a published podcast. So if we wanted to model this as a create or store action, we could say that what we're creating is a published podcast. And the raw materials for creating a published podcast is an existing unpublished podcast. Let's take a look at what that would actually look like if we implemented it. So we could update this controller to be a published podcasts controller, change the action to be store, and then change the URL to just be this top-level resource published podcasts. Okay? Let's make this controller and take a look. Okay, so here we got the published podcast controller. Let's grab our publish action and move this over. So now, instead of publishing an existing podcast, what we're doing is we're storing a new published podcast. We lose that route parameter, right? So we have to accept that in the request instead, which honestly I think makes sense, because if you look at what it takes to create a regular podcast, the raw materials for creating that podcast come in the request, not through the routes or anything, right? So when we're creating a new podcast, the raw materials are a title, a description, and a website, and we kind of bundle those up to create a new podcast. But when we're publishing a podcast or creating a new published podcast, the raw materials are the identifier for an existing podcast. So now we have like a dedicated controller for publishing podcasts. And instead of returning this empty response, which kind of seemed like the most natural thing to do when we were using a publish action, maybe we want to return this podcast as JSON now so that the consumer can kind of see, okay, it's got a published equals true JSON attribute set or something that I can use to update my view in some interesting way. So if we're going to use store for creating a new published podcast, then unpublishing a podcast naturally would be destroying the published podcast. This one is probably the biggest stretch in sort of your imagination and sort of mapping it, because we're not deleting a podcast, but we are taking a published podcast and we're making it not exist anymore. Instead, we have a regular podcast. So I like the idea of modeling that as like a destroy action on a published podcast. So now we can change this URL to be published podcasts, and then the ID of the published podcast, which just happens to be the same ID as the regular podcast, because they are the same entity. They're just being modeled as separate resources. And then in our podcast controller, we can take this unpublish action, cut that out, move that over to the published podcast controller, rename it to destroy. If we wanted to here, we could even scope this based on published, right? To make sure that we can only unpublish podcasts that are published. We unpublish it, and then you could either return an empty response, but what I find to be more practical most of the time is to return kind of the deleted podcast in its new kind of representation. That seems to be more practical for my front end most of the time. So let's move those down as well and kind of see what we're left with at the end of the day after all this work that we did. So now we've got a podcast controller, which just has the standard CRUD or REST actions for working with a podcast, right? Just the 7 basic ones. And if I'm being honest, this is a pretty big controller, right? It's still 7 actions. We were going for like an average of 4. But the nice thing about using this rule, this constraint of only use standard REST actions or standard CRUD actions, is that this is the absolute upper limit in actions for any controller you'll ever create. So we know it can never get bigger than this. And most of the time, honestly, I don't find myself needing all 7 actions for most resources in my application. Most of the time, it's 2 or 3, especially when you start creating these new controllers for different things. And before we go any further, I should show that one final tip like this. So what we were doing with the published podcast is if you have a resource that's transitioning state as a result of some action, you can often treat that resource in that state as its own dedicated resource. So like published podcasts can be different from podcasts. Even something like popular episodes can be different from episodes. Instead of having all these query parameters and trying to do all this finagling in your controller, in one controller to figure that all out, just point them at different controllers. It makes things a lot simpler. So if something's transitioning state or is filtered in some way, a lot of the time you can treat the filtered version of that or that specific state as its own resource and give it its own controller. Did it again. So we got this big controller with 7 actions. It's not the end of the world. But now we have a dedicated podcast episodes controller for nested resources. And it only has 3 actions. And that's like all we'll probably ever need here, which is great. That's a nice little controller. We've got the podcast cover image controller. So we're treating the cover image as a separate resource because it's exposed independently through the UI. And the nice thing about this, too, if you look at it, say for whatever reason, like uploading and saving this file was like a little bit more complicated, and that Laravel was like a worse framework, it didn't make this like brain dead easy for you. If we needed to add 2 private methods to this controller to support this and make it easier, we wouldn't feel like we had some big bloated out of control controller. It's 1 action with 2 private methods. Imagine we had to add those 2 private methods to the original controller that had 13 actions. That's when you start thinking, oh, fuck, I need a command bus or something. You know what I mean? So the nice thing about moving these things to dedicated controllers is it kind of removes that pressure to come up with other more sophisticated ways to simplify your controller code. Subscriptions controller, this one is cool because by forcing ourselves to use this constraint of CRUD, we actually like uncovered a new like domain concept in our application. Like thinking in terms of CRUD enriched our domain, which sounds like counterintuitive a lot of the time, but CRUD is a powerful thing. And then we have published podcasts. So we're treating published podcasts as its own resource, this filtered version of a podcast of a specific state. And now we're able to move that custom publish and custom unpublish action out to its own controller. Again, just 2 actions. Our episodes controller even got smaller because we were able to move 2 of those actions out to the podcast episodes controller. So let's check this out now. Let's see how many actions do we have in total and how many controllers do we have in total. So it looks like we have 19 actions and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 controllers. 19 actions spread over 6 controllers is an average of 3.16 actions per controller, instead of what we had before, which was 19 actions split over 2 controllers, which is 9.5 actions per controller. So now we're actually doing better than Basecamp. So to kind of finish things off, next time you're working on an application and you find yourself with a big controller that you want to try and simplify in some way, instead of looking at the individual actions in that controller and trying to figure out how can I make this action shorter by extracting a form request or creating a service object or introducing, God forbid, a command bus. Instead, try and figure out ways to cut that controller up into more controllers. And if you can make that work, I think you'll often find that you don't need to go any further than that. Because everything is CRUD with a little imagination. That's all I got. Thanks for coming to Laracon and checking out my talk. I hope you enjoyed it.